Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Chapman. I run the software practice here at MacStadium. And today, I'd kind of like to talk to you about managing Mac DevOps in the enterprise, so you guys get a feel for this. First thing to kind of go through is Mac in the enterprise in general, and why is it different? In general, Apple makes some of the best products in the world for the best experience in the world, but that creates a different experience when you're on the other end of it trying to build things and when you're trying to use that hardware to do enterprise development. Generally, that causes challenges because there's no such thing as a multi-tenant public cloud for Mac. So if you're looking at AWS or Azure or GCP, that doesn't exist there. Mac hardware also, again, is designed for the experience in the hand on the desktop for the consumer. And so that means the hardware in your enterprise is not really built for that, to go into a closet or to go into a data center. So it presents a lot of challenges just from general setup and connectivity to actual usage. Again, around that, it creates scalability issues when you start to try to work around those situations. You'll try to do things to put them in-house in a way that you do with your non-Mac servers, or you'll try to manage them in a way that you're used to managing other systems or clouds. And those tools and technologies aren't ready built for Mac, so they present a lot of one-offs and workarounds and just honestly things that don't work. And then if you do get the hardware set up correctly, you can always virtualize it, but this again leads to taking a desktop system and trying to make it an enterprise virtualization solution. So the technologies for virtualization do exist, but they present their own set of problems, and they make managing Macs with virtualization even trickier. So when we've gone around and helped customers, we've asked them to kind of send us their current setup, and then we can give them a before and after when they get set up. And there's varying levels of sophistication, but we tend to call this a hashtag DevOps situation. It's not negligence or people trying to be ridiculous. It's just trying to make the best of a weird situation and trying to do the best you can to set up something that can be somewhat usable for the dev team, but it generally leads to situations like this where you just have crazy desktop setups or homemade racks that have some sort of baking tray or kind of cobbled together stuff, or a myriad of switches and tangles and wires, and it works while it works, but if anything goes wrong, it usually presents lots of challenges. So that's honestly why MacStadium exists. We thought that making life easier for Mac developers was an important thing. It's a very important platform. It's a very important revenue stream for lots of people, and it's how most businesses in the world engage their customers now through mobile devices, and the iPhone is definitely a mobile device that has a lot of eyes on it. So we set out to build an enterprise grade data center quality farm of Apple equipment, and that is how we became one of the only enterprise grade cloud stacks for Mac. We took all those consumer parts that I was mentioning, and we put a lot of specific engineering around that. So, I mean, you see in the picture here on the slide, that's an example of one of our Pro racks, but there's a lot of thoughtful preparation on how they can be maintained and managed inside of a rack, how they can be cooled, how they can connect to storage and network and make the most out of the ports and the density that you can get out of them. So what this means for folks in the enterprise is it converts you from having to deal with that sort of cobbled together situation to kind of treating it like a cloud again, which is what you want to do. It helps you focus on development, not hardware. And this ultimately leads you to solving better problems than managing the hardware stack, which is iOS and CI/CD builds, which is in and of itself its own challenge. So MacStadium private clouds, and that's something to note with Mac infrastructure, and back to the AWS and GCP sort of example, one of the challenges hyperscalers have with Mac hardware in general is that they do not allow for multi-tenant hardware. Apple does not allow for multi-tenant hardware. So you're needing dedicated hardware, but you're needing it to work in a cloud-like manner. So MacStadium figured this problem out and has started providing private cloud infrastructure with dedicated hardware, but in a scalable way. And we make it simple to deploy and scalable, and then add the layers of integration tools like APIs and plugins, and have the support and expertise around that with geodiversity to make it really truly act and feel like a cloud for you without having to deal with all the hardware concerns. The other benefit and added capability is that by putting these things in data centers, like most companies want to do, you get security and ISO and SOC. And as a matter of fact, MacStadium's taken extraordinary steps to be certified at the highest level for all of their facilities, which gives you the benefit of also gaining that certification. One of the case studies I want to talk to you about specifically with regards to security and sort of taking something from an on-prem to a data center setup is our good customer Capital One. They are an extremely large bank. You've all seen their commercials and know of them, but they also would describe themselves as a technology company. They really innovate very, very well on the software front, and they're always pushing the envelope. And they have a huge engineering team that has a lot of build to do. They were doing up to 3,000 builds per day, and they're on bare metal, which they had done a good job of building a solution that would work for them. But bare metal breaks, bare metal is complicated to maintain, and the speed of development is constantly increasing. So updating those Macs and keeping them running and managing them was becoming quite a problem. In addition to that, because they're a bank, there were exceptional security requirements around, physical security and data integrity and compliance, and that's a big concern for them. So putting it in any data closet or any data center just isn't an option. So with our help and partnering with them, we built a ready-made solution that combines the best in breed storage with Mac hardware, and then we virtualize that with them. So we use our virtualization expertise on Apple hardware and combine that with their build expertise and their development expertise, and created a system for them that really helped them turn what they had into a true cloud and take their build and test environment time from minutes to seconds. And that's partly because of the power of virtualization, and partly because of taking out all the ops complexity around the hardware management and the imaging that you typically have to do with bare metal. It really sped things up. And here you see a quote from Alex, and he really, he's really focused on the dev team and serving the dev team. And it's all about keeping their pace and keeping their speed and keeping their ability to focus on their task and not waiting on a server or waiting on an image or waiting on something to get built. So this was an example of how a properly built cloud can provide security and scalability and let you focus on your tasks. Now, that kind of rolls into DevOps and CI/CD on Mac in general. When you're looking at build and development in general, folks are used to AWS or Azure or GCP, and the CI/CD processes there, or Kubernetes or Docker. It's become a very ephemeral, grab stuff when you need it, build stuff how you want it, throw it away, and don't worry about the infrastructure kind of world that we live in. But when you hit the Mac world, again, you're dealing with a totally different animal. CI/CD in general is a bit lagging in the Mac world because of how Mac works, how Xcode works, and how Apple licenses and provisions your build system. So it generally has left that build curve a little bit behind what the rest of the non-Apple development community is used to. It's more of a desktop mentality. It's more of a build a really cool app on your laptop kind of mentality. Again, this is great, but as you start to scale, it becomes very problematic. So the CI/CD tooling system is emerging, and it's emerging fast on Apple, but it's still catching up. And that means that a lot of Mac dev teams spend a lot of time trying to get parity with other tools or parity with other dev systems, or they end up scripting or cobbling or sort of trying to orchestrate through customization a CI/CD setup that gets them to where they need to be compared to the rest of their build team. One case study that I'd like to kind of highlight here that is a really good example is another customer, Nubank. They're in Brazil. They're very, very adept at Apple build and Apple technology. They spend a lot of time thinking about how to solve that problem, and they basically did it almost the best way you could do it prior to jumping on MacStadium. Is they had their Xcode server in-house. They were using Xcode server. They were managing their iOS development, and they had a pretty sophisticated CI/CD pipeline, but outages constantly occurred. Caches had to be updated and cleared. The server itself was a problem. And then when you went to CI as a service solutions, they had enough of a sophistication level in how they did build and test that they didn't have the flexibility that they needed with a sort of a canned process or an out of the box process. And they really needed a lot of control and flexibility. So they came to us with this problem and said, you know, CI as a service isn't quite a fit for us. We have too many specifics to deal with, and we have too many things in our CI/CD process. But we still need that flexibility, and we still don't want to care about having a server in the closet. So coming to MacStadium, again, they built a virtual cloud. They put their own customizations and automations and CI tooling around it, and it allowed them to really automate the infrastructure as code, and abstract that layer of maintenance and management that was bogging them down. And at the end of the day, it honestly enabled them to reduce their build times by about a third, down to a third of what they used to be. So it was very empowering for agility, for speed of development, and for flexibility in setting up the CI/CD process in general, because again, you abstract out the headache of hardware. And you see here, Victor kind of saying, you know, he specifically had to spend quite a bit of time managing and maintaining the systems and losing what was basically a man day every month for fixing and tweaking and doing things like that. So that's a big gain in productivity to move. Which leads me to thinking about CI/CD and DevOps with MacStadium as a cloud and having a flexible cloud. It started us thinking down a path, and part of my job when I arrived here was taking what we already had and turning it into something even more automated and more developer focused. So our goal was to really think about what enterprise development meant and to try to figure out a way to make it viable for MacStadium as a cloud. So the first thing that occurred to us was that Kubernetes was the best way to orchestrate infrastructure globally in data centers. That's its purpose. That's what it was built for. And if there was a way to empower Mac users to have that same capability, we'd really have something useful for them, because they could orchestrate data centers and clouds just like everybody else could. So that is where we started coming up with our Kubernetes for Enterprise offering. We put Docker controls around a Mac image because the first step was figuring out how to put the Mac image in a context that Kubernetes could understand and orchestrate, and that's typically a container. So we put Docker controls around Mac OS. We built a platform for delivery, and then put that as a Kubernetes layer, and then allowed image building to occur and interfaces and controls to allow the users to orchestrate that. So the image you have here on the slide is basically kind of showing you a logical view of this Kubernetes infrastructure. There's basically Mac capacity attached to flash storage and networking. Those constitute the hardware layer. The hardware layer is then abstracted with Kubernetes, and then Kubernetes is further abstracted with a control system that orchestrates your macOS build and your macOS images. And we call this Orka, Orchestration with Kubernetes on Apple. So the goal again was to kind of I mean, the whole purpose of MacStadium is helping development and management of Mac infrastructure. So for us, this was the next logical step to meet developers where they live. Don't make it an operations experience, make it a developer experience. So it's easy to use, even if you don't have Kubernetes experience. Because the other thing we had to consider is, although Kubernetes is an excellent way to orchestrate infrastructure and manage hardware and cloud, it is not necessarily intuitive, and it is certainly not something that is familiar to the Apple developer community. So being able to leverage its power without having to go through the vertical learning curve of figuring out how Kubernetes works was pretty important. So we did build an interface and a set of tooling that makes it easy to use. So you can use basic commands, and the commands themselves will direct Kubernetes to do the right things so that you don't have to. But then there's also environments and pieces of the product that allow you, if you're more of an expert with Kubernetes, to dive in and do what you know how to do. So it kind of gives you the capability to do as little or as much as you want. It's very software driven. So again, it lets a developer engage with tooling that they're familiar with, and they can orchestrate and drive things just like the other dev teams that they're around to do all day long, every day with AWS or Azure. And it's integrated. So we didn't build a custom version of Kubernetes. We use compliant, conformant Kubernetes. We're Kubernetes conformant. We're part of the CNCF Foundation. So this is the Kubernetes that everybody knows and loves, but with an Apple twist and with an opinionated control plane on top of it that lets you use your existing pipeline technologies with Kubernetes and Apple all mixed together. So let's walk through this Orka product and exactly what's happening here. Again, kind of much like the last picture where you saw sort of the hardware software mix. There's basically hardware connected to high performing SAN, and then it has a virtualization layer, and in that virtualization layer lies Orka. And Orka integrates directly with the Kubernetes control layer, and then that produces containerized macOS VMs that you can put your applications and builds into and drive forward. One thing to note here is, again, that the Kubernetes control plane is vanilla, and also that the macOS VM is not a modified Mac version. So we are not taking macOS and hacking it or injecting any kind of kernel extensions or doing any kind of modification in any way. As a matter of fact, we often have customers that have a requirement to bring their own clean install version of macOS, and that's totally fine. That's what we expect. Additionally, we're not integrating tooling, so we're not giving you specific versions of Xcode or specific versions of anything else. That is your relationship to Apple, and that's why we want to maintain it that way. So this lets you use the technology and the tooling to do the job that you want to do, but without having to worry about it being done in some sort of one-off or customized way. And our base OS is really a Linux plus KVM kind of blend that integrates with everything. And then it lets you have the power of orchestrated tools like kube control or YAML or Terraform or Ansible. So again, our goal is to let developers drive it in a developer-centric way, which means infrastructure as code or automated pipelines or things like that. So the goal is to make it as simple and as seamless as possible. And to that end, what we did out of the box to start with was to write plugins that integrate with some of the most popular platforms out there today. And the reason we decided to take the lead on writing the first couple is that we wanted to make sure we gave our opinion on the right way to use the API and the right way to engage the platform. So things like Jenkins and TeamCity and GitHub and Actions and GitLab, BuildKite, Helm and Tecton have a way to basically have a straightforward, clear example how to use it. And if you have a team that's on one of those platforms, while they're learning Orka and figuring out how Orka works for their Mac builds, it's also quite simple to simply plug the plugin into your CI tool and have Orka run in the background. It's not something you then have to think about as much. So Orka has been released, and in the the theme of the case studies here, we have an example of a customer who we're very proud of, Homebrew. They're very, very important to the Apple ecosystem. If you don't know them, they're an open source software, but it basically is RPM or you know, a package management system for Apple, and it makes development and package management on Apple amazingly easy. They came to us and they were fairly sophisticated. They've been running on MacStadium for quite a while, so they're used to the tools and the technology. They ran VMware and ESX with linked clones, so they were doing what they could on VMware. They still had the struggle of, that's a tool that's really great, and virtualization provides a lot of leverage, but it also requires you to know quite a bit about operations and management and virtualization. So there's still a certain amount of hands-on dealing with the virtualization technology. And they also had some things that were kind of a struggle by nature of how they build and how the open source product worked. As you can see here, a pull request could take 24 hours of build time and kill the whole CPU on a system. And when they tried to go to, again, CI as a service platforms, it's not that those platforms aren't very valuable and very good at what they do, but when you get into customized things like this, things like GitHub Actions aren't configurable enough for them to use the way they want to. And they found that when they got into Orka, with the container technology and with the way you could allocate Kubernetes resources and pod distribution, that everything didn't have to be all the same size, and that resources could kind of be spread out differently and could be, you know, in Kubernetes, you tend to have the concept of reserved resources. So you ask for the resource you need to do your job, it reserves it, and it does that job. That's something that Orka takes advantage of quite a bit. And it basically allowed them to really distribute their workload in a way that they weren't capable of doing before, or at least not capable of doing without a lot of manual work and a lot of configuration. And then in addition, Homebrew being a package management system that runs on the command line, you can imagine their dev team and their developers are super familiar with command line. And Orka is definitely a CLI first sort of product. So having a CLI that was quick and easy made infrastructure as code quite good for them. And you know, we're kind of proud of this quote from Mike, where he said basically that Orka is about as close as you can get to AWS to spin up and spin down VMs with an API or a CLI that there is for Apple. And again, like I said, that's kind of been our goal from the start, is to help the Apple ecosystem get into that same kind of cloud context that the rest of the world deals with every day. So that said, I would strongly encourage everybody who wants to take a look at this to give it a shot. One of the things we wanted to do, again, is make it simple for folks to try out and use, so you can see, if for no other reason, to get your head around the differences in the way Macs can work. You can understand how bare metal works, you can understand how virtualization works, and with this now you can understand kind of the difference between that and what Orka is trying to provide as Orka. If you go to tryorka.com, it basically will provision you a Kubernetes cluster on the fly, and then let you walk through a step-by-step tutorial that literally tells you everything you need to do, and at the end of it, you'll have an iOS app that you can play with and that you can see. Obviously, don't put your secret sauce in here. It is a temporary environment, but it'll give you a really good idea of how quick and easy Mac infrastructure can be used. I think it's pretty powerful and compelling to watch someone who, and we've had folks that aren't iOS builders, come in and literally in 20 minutes go from provisioning raw infrastructure to deploying a fully realized iOS app and seeing it work. That's kind of unprecedented, and it really illustrates the capability. You know, when you're in here, you can explore the CLI, as I've alluded to. There's a command line interface. Development teams in general, whether you're going to use bare metal, VMware, or Orka or other, it's becoming a world where I don't want to leave my IDE, and I want to be able to describe anything that I need as code. And through that mechanism, I either want to do that through a CLI or an API and get it quickly. So Orka has a step-by-step kind of guided tour to kind of give you an idea of what we think a CLI should work like. You also get exposure to how plugins would work with the Orca system as well. So again, I just encourage you, if you're curious about Kubernetes specifically, or Kubernetes on Apple, or this Orca thing, to give the demo a try. And if Orca is not your thing, or Kubernetes is not necessarily a direction of your team, whether it's because you have a lot of tech debt on the hardware side, or whether you have a vested interest in VMware virtualization because you have a lot of expertise in that area, or otherwise, there's just some things that we've learned over the years doing this all day, every day, that we really like to emphasize in relation to this talk about what are the right things to do with Apple infrastructure, and how do you make it ideal for your DevOps team and your developers. And so here I just wanted to kind of go over those real quick, and remember that there are unique concerns with Apple. And one of the things that really gets overlooked a lot, because people are trying to get work done and people are trying to develop stuff as fast as they can, and to get the product out there, it often gets neglected because, again, the form factor of the technology is what it is, that enterprise development really does warrant enterprise infrastructure. And even though this is not out of the box an enterprise infrastructure technology, you need to set it up as though it were, because at some point the momentum of the team and the work that they're doing and the challenges that they're going to face are going to require that agility, that flexibility, and that scalability. And if you don't have it set up that way, you will hit a wall, and you will hit problems, and you'll kill momentum. And it's just something to think about when you set things up. The teams are going to build processes around this, and dev teams now, just by the nature of their education, tend to think in terms of cloud and cloud flexibility and efficiency, and even how they manage their cost. So setting your Apple infrastructure up in a way that acts like a cloud is critically important, just so that you have that match with how dev is treating the tool. And then the last part, and again, it's often the last thing folks want to focus on because it's not directly tied to the output, but it's certainly a critical part of what you do, is security and compliance. Again, what we see with these tools is, because they're not ready-made for a rack, or because they're not scalable blades, that folks jam them under desks, or put them in drawers, or put them in places that just completely would be unacceptable from a security and compliance standpoint for any other team. But it's, oh, it's Apple, that's how you have to do it. That's far from the truth, and not what you should be doing. So, again, I would encourage you, whether you came to MacStadium to get our help with it, because that's what we do, or if you want to do it on your own, because that's what you feel like you need to do right now, you need to build for resilience and scalability. So again, plan for, do like any other data center or manager would do. You plan for failure, you plan for maintenance, you plan for the ability for this to be resilient and scalable. What happens when the workload doubles, triples? How do you do that? How do you image that? How do you manage that? And usually that leads you into virtualization or automation for flexibility, right? You're going to have to inject some sort of tooling that allows you to either image the bare metal, or some sort of virtualization capability that lets you quickly scale different workloads across different hardware. And again, you're going to need to secure the environment. I think it gets largely overlooked that security is critical for development, because this is often the IP and the value of your company. So proper networking, proper firewalling, proper security in general from a physical perspective are critically important. And setting that up is something that needs to be thought about as you build it, not after you build it. It's very, very important. And then the last piece is, once you get all that put together, you need to, again, roll back to what the dev team's going to do and how they're going to use it. You want this to be easy to integrate. So if you're going to make them come out of what they're doing and try to figure out how to write the tools they need to make it work, you're going to lose a lot of productivity on their side. So you want to come to them as much as possible and make their services quick and easy. Figure out what CI systems they're using, figure out what automation and orchestration systems they're using, and make that something that's quick and easy to do. Well, that's kind of the overview of what I wanted to talk to you about. That is Mac in the enterprise, all the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if you want to learn more, I'd love to encourage you to get started with Orka or come to MacStadium and do tryorka.com, or just come to MacStadium and check out the offerings that we have. We, again, offer a lot of variety in the way of bare metal and virtualization technologies, but we're very, very proud of Orka. You can also look at the docs, and you can also contact us at orka@macstadium.com to ask questions, find out more information, or even set up a trial. That's kind of what I had for the talk, and I'm definitely open to questions if anybody has anything to ask.